You are listening to the Gospel-Centered Education Podcast, brought to you by Community Christian School in Tallahassee, Florida.
Hello, and welcome to the Gospel-Centered Education Podcast. My name is Tom Argerson, your host, and my co-host is Kelly Allen. Hey, Kelly.
Hey, Tom. On the Gospel-Centered Education Podcast, we explore how we as Jesus followers connect the dots between education, contemporary culture, and biblical theology, and live like Jesus in a broken and challenging world. And I'm so excited because today we have Dr. Nari Jeter with us. Hey, we're so glad to have you on here. Let me tell everybody just a little bit about you. Number one, me and you are friends, and we're neighbors, and I love it that you're here. Thank you so much for coming on. But more importantly, you have been married for 18 years, and you have two beautiful children with your husband, Danny. Noah and Caleb are your sons. You are a master's and a PhD in marriage and family therapy, and you also have additional certifications in 3 different couples therapy programs. One of them was pairs, right? Because me and my husband did pairs. It's a really good one. And you've worked in mental health in a hospital setting, residential, and a private practice. And you've also worked with children, adolescents, adults, couples, and families. And you currently are a teaching professor in human development and family science at FSU. And you have a private practice as a marriage and family therapist. So you're a busy woman.
I like to be busy.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Today we're talking about parenting beyond fear and anxiety. And I just want to ask you, what led you into your current profession?
Right. So I think a lot of people have the assumption that therapists are these perfected human beings who kind of just stand above everyone else and have all this wisdom and guidance and have no flaws or hurts or hangups, but that's actually not true. A lot of us are propelled into the profession because we've recognized we've had struggles in our families or within ourselves, and we want to learn to help other people overcome those things. So for me, a lot of that was my own kind of family and childhood experiences, but I think it all culminated to like one specific summer where I was in college. I thought I wanted to be a doctor. I love children. I'm like, oh, I could combine my love of science and people and be a pediatrician. But I was blessed enough to be able to go on a faith-based medical mission trip with my college. And it was while I was there that I, just kind of realized that I had a lot more interest in talking with people, getting to know them, helping them with fear and anxiety as they kind of approached our mission team to receive medical care, and also just really felt like God gave me the space during that mission trip to hear him through my peers and my professors. And that also happened to be the same summer that my parents were going through a divorce. And so I think, again, there was a lot happening there. It was a summer of great joy and like this amazing foundational experience, but also some pain and really having to make some tough decisions that even maybe went against what people had hoped for me, but feeling very confident. And as the plan unfolded, seeing that what God wants for us will come easily, his path will be easy. And so I was able to kind of pivot, and I found marriage and family therapy that I didn't even know was a profession, and thought, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I want to do. I want to help people with their marriages. I want to help families with their struggles. And as soon as I started school, again, had that confirmation of this is my passion. I now have a label for it. So just wanted to keep going and studying, and ended up where I am today.
It's amazing how formative those experiences can be. In 2002, I was in Cameroon, West Africa, for a couple of weeks, not for a month, but and that was an incredibly formative time. And so it sounds like that was kind of a catalyst that God used for some vocation and calling to emerge.
Yes, absolutely. I was not expecting that. I just thought, I'm going to get to go do this really amazing thing. And all the preparation leading up to that, never had questioned, am I going to leave, my plans to be a medical doctor? But then it happened happened there. So, I mean, there weren't these little hints of that happening. It just kind of happened all at once.
And there's so many people, I think, that can share that story of just a lot of pain in either their upbringing or in their parents' relationship or the relationship of their parents with them or whatever it might be. So, gosh, that's just such a almost ubiquitous thing. It's so common, and unfortunately, and then to realize that even out of that pain, God can use that pain to actually move you into a space, into a calling that could actually be so helpful to people.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, for sure. So, yeah. So when you think about your work right now, because obviously you are it sounds like you're really busy. So what's the focus of your work right now?
So at FSU, I'm a teaching professor in human development and family science, and one of the classes I teach, and actually it's hard to say this, but I've been teaching it for this fall will be my 20th year.
Wow.
Because I taught it as a graduate student and then have continued to teach it. But in the class, it's called Family Relationships, and that is a really great opportunity for me to teach young college students about families. And I believe it's one of the most important classes they'll take, because you may never be an accountant or do accounting or college algebra ever again, but you will always have a family. So in that class, we get to talk about learning better communication skills, how to manage conflict. We talk about boundaries and what are healthy, appropriate boundaries for different members of the family. And so I love that class, and I get to teach, per year about 500 students. And it really, when I think about over the years, the thousands, I think it's in the tens of thousands at this point.
It has to be.
I'll still have students reach out and say that was a transformational class for them, just because they actually got to learn something that applied to everyday life. So I love that class. And then I also have a private practice. I've evolved over time what my specialty was. At one point, God led me to a faith-based eating disorder treatment facility as like my first job out of my PhD. Wow. And I did that for 3 years, and I absolutely loved it. But it was very intense work, and over time I realized I needed to take a step back for my self-care. But I returned to my first passion, which was always couples. I really, through my own experience, realized even though marriage is a beautiful thing and a wonderful thing, the actual negotiation day in and day out of how that works does not come naturally. And still, I mean, it can feel good and it can feel comfortable and lovely, but especially when it comes to solving problems as couples and managing the ups and downs of life, we need a lot of support and a lot of help to do that as married couples.
For sure.
Yeah.
And gosh, I can't really think of a more important subject to take in college than
know.
Something like, right?
I bet you have helped numerous people.
Yeah, and it just seems as if, and I'm not in the same profession as you, but as an educator, we see a lot every day of just, for lack of a better way to say it, just the brokenness of people, including ourselves. And so you have that amazing platform that God's given you in that really what's a secular setting, to be able to speak some truth in a way that is universal principles that still are true even today, with all of the cultural narratives flying about and everything. And do you find that part of it kind of challenging, or is that does that work easily for you?
Right. So in a college setting, I want to respect that those students are coming to me from all different backgrounds. And one of my philosophies about connecting with people, whether it's in therapy or in the classroom, is you have to meet them where they are. You can't call to them from a distance and say, come to me. And so I let my students know that I'm a Christian, I'm a believer. I let them know how I was raised and where I came from. And I share a lot of personal examples so that I don't seem distant or judgmental to them, and to let them know kind of where I've been in life. And I give them a couple of different options in the sense that, yes, you can listen to my examples, but what I really want you to do is challenge yourself to think about how this applies to your own life and how your values, like culturally, religiously, socioeconomically, all of those things affect the way you think about family. So I think that's a really important thing. Is I think that for anyone who may be new to college, which is very intimidating, or a non-believer, hearing something about families and coming off as the expert, it can seem maybe intimidating, unattainable, or judgmental. And I've taken like spiritual gifts assessments before and things like that. And I really try to think about like where God would use me in those moments. And I think of myself as like a seed planter. And that if I'm the first and or only believer that they would encounter at school or in this stage of their life, are they going to walk away feeling like loved, cared for, that they matter, that I'm interested in them, that, and as a believer representing that God would be interested in them. I'm planting those seeds through being just having grace with them about this very like sensitive topic in their lives.
That's so good. That's great. So I'm curious, all these young people that you contacted over the years, have you noticed any particular themes that tend to just emerge throughout the course as they begin to share a little bit more about their situations through assignments or in class or whatever, that seem to be like the major themes that...
Yeah, I think our young people actually are probably more aware than I was in college about like relationships and emotions, and they're more aware of like the culture and what's happening around them. And I think that is a great foundation, like that awareness. But I think sometimes, it can be overwhelming. There's so much, and especially with like social media, like you can know what's going on in other countries across the world, like in real time. And so I think that while they are more aware, they have all this information available to them, they don't necessarily know how to use it in practical ways to like better their own lives. So I think that while I probably lived and can like reflect back on my peers in much more of a bubble growing up, I think that, to some degree, these young people, they do want to do better than generations before, and they feel very passionate about it. But I think sometimes it's really hard for them to like find that path forward.
And I wonder if that just is another really added pressure if you're trying to make it work better than your folks did or your grandparents or whatever, and yet the circumstances are so different now. And of course, at my age, I can look back even further and go, you remember a time when we had a party line telephone in our house. I mean, literally, it was a 17-party line.
Right.
Ever tell you that?
No.
Oh, it's crazy. And so you try to get on the phone and be like, get off the phone. It's just crazy.
Right.
And people can't even imagine it. So much has changed technologically and everything in that time. And I don't know that relationships have change. I mean, I think people are people. I think humans are humans. We have the same needs and desires in a lot of ways, even though we're unique in some ways. But I think those other things that you're mentioning, Dr. Jeter, have impinged on the ability of people to walk through life without a tremendous amount of anxiety that, golly, how am I going to navigate all of this stuff? I think we're going to talk about that in a minute when we talk about parenting. So have you had, as an educator, there are always students that stand out or stories that stand out in your history with kids and young people. Is there any particular story that stands out of a student maybe that you can relate a little bit of, and just kind of maybe a little bit of how their journey was affected by your class or by the things that you were sharing?
I don't think there's one particular student I can think of. I know I've had some students and it's hard for me to think of them this way, but now they're parents and they have children, and they might be going through some tough life transitions, and they will reach out to me via social media and say, I didn't know who else to reach out to, and I remembered you, and can you make some recommendations for me, whether it's for a couples therapist, or I get a lot of these like, is this normal types of questions, and so I think there's been a lot of that over the years. I will say that several students a year will email me privately and tell me, hey, I really appreciate that you were willing to share your faith with us, and just share that you were a believer and what your beliefs are and how you celebrate your holidays, and that was validating for them. But I think in wanting to be respectful, I've wanted to make sure, again, that I always want to point students back to your beliefs, your values, your traditions. They are important to you, and I don't ever want to disrespect that. And having traveled around the world a lot to Africa or Asia and other places, I have a great amount of respect for other people's cultures and beliefs. But I think for some college students, they do find it like validating to maybe connect with someone and go, that's maybe what I aspire to.
Yeah. Well, I think this topic is so incredibly important for many reasons. One of the reasons I think it's so important is that in our daily work, we continue to contact both young people and parents and families who are just really struggling with how to make sense of life, how to understand where God is in all of it. If they're faith-based people, if they're believers or followers of Jesus, and just how the pieces kind of fit together. And also, we see a lot of people trying to live perfect lives in certain way, like selectively perfect. It's like in certain ways, but in other ways it doesn't really matter, which is really kind of an odd and interesting thing. But I think that leads kind of our shifting maybe to focusing on parents.
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about anxiety in children. Last week we had Anna Nelson, and she was telling us, just how children deal with anxiety. But in parenting, is it normal to be like an anxious parent, to be anxious in your parenting style and stuff like that?
I would say absolutely, and I think that every parent picks like an area where they choose maybe are anxious in. I know, for example, I'm very anxious about my children's education. Like, I want, not that they have to be like high performers, but I want to be a very engaged mom and set some good structure for them. And it's, of course, because I am in education, and I loved school growing up. School was my safe place. So I'm kind of passing, some of that on to my kids, but also maybe being overly worried about it. Whereas my husband would be a little bit more relaxed about school, but he's very anxious about safety because he is retired from law enforcement. So he saw a lot of, very sad and tragic things where children's, safety was at risk. So I think we probably translate our anxiety from places in our lives where we have our own trauma, maybe in places that were not healed from our own childhood, or maybe these expectations that we have that can, sometimes be unrealistic.
So it's normal that I'm anxious at times in my parenting style.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
I would love to hear a little. I think that's really fascinating. So I think what you said a minute ago, and if I heard it correctly, is that the areas we tend to carry anxiety are the very areas where we ourselves experience some sort of either trauma, micro-trauma, or something in our own lives. Can you unpack that just a little bit more? Because I think that's a really important point.
Yeah.
Right, absolutely. I always tell people, wherever the hurt is, like wherever you feel the most uncomfortable, that's the place you have to go to. The place you don't want to go to that's the sign that there is a hidden treasure there that
That's
you have to
interesting.
unpack. And so I've heard Christian therapists and probably books I've read that says, if we're looking at even like what the Bible talks about, and therapists will talk about like generational trauma, like things that are passed amongst generations, is if it's not healed, it will be passed down. So
It'll keep coming up.
And so I think that as far as parents go, today's parents may look back at their own childhood and say, okay, I didn't have a father that was present, or, my mother was depressed and disengaged a lot. And so then they will hyper monitor themselves and go, am I not doing enough with my kids? Or am I not there
True.
all the time? And even if they have reasonable reasons for, I had to work late occasionally, the guilt or the negative feelings they'll take on for that, not because given the situation, it's a realistic amount of guilt or sadness or whatever, but it's coming from that place of, this is what I lacked, and so now I want to provide it to my children in like overabundance.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah. So do you have a sense that the kind of the curated lives that are portrayed on social media, especially certain platforms, do you think that can contribute to the way parents see, well, it's supposed to be this perfect kind of cool thing, but it really isn't?
Absolutely. I mean, I know this, I think about it and I talk about it, but sometimes I'll find myself looking at my friends or people I know, their social medias, and going, wow, this is amazing. But we just went to Disney World last weekend and we had like a great time with our kids, and they're 8 and 11 and have way more emotional control than they did when they were younger. There were lots of kids crying at Disney and a lot of stressed out parents. And I'm sure they were taking all these really cute Disney pictures.
So true.
That everyone's like, look at them, this perfect family. Their toddler is so well behaved. But I saw that toddler like melting down. So I absolutely think that. I mean, I always say, like, I have this cheesy kind of expression, but God gave us eyes to look outward, and so it's so easy for us to believe what we see outside of us at face value. The harder thing is looking inward. And looking inward, we don't have eyes for that. We have to do that with like our hearts and our minds and our spirit. And so we get easily deceived by what we see outwardly. And we have to do the work inwardly to like manage that deception.
I remember one of the things that I realized, we have 4 kids, and now all of them are married, and almost all of them have children of their own. But I remember just as a dad, waking up one day after about 2 weeks into our first, after Abby was born, our oldest, I remember waking up in the middle of the night going, oh my gosh, I'm a father. And there's all this, just this heaviness in a way. And then but back then we didn't have all of that. So we had our friend group or whatever, but we didn't have all of those curation, all those curated lives and everything to compare to. But yet there's still that sense, I think it must be inborn at some level, that most people want to do well by their kids. They want to do the right thing. They want to take care of them properly, etc. But sometimes our own stuff can get in the way, and that's where it can get pretty messy sometimes.
That's perfect. I think that a lot is that, but I think where parents then struggle with fear and anxiety is they can't tell themselves that. They can't say, I want to do my best. I know I'm doing my best, but here are some things I can work on. So I think that's absolutely right.
So you were saying we need to press into the harder areas. What else can we do to like overcome the anxiety and fear in parenting?
Right. I mean, I definitely think like having someone to talk to, like they say like the expression is it takes a village to like raise a child. And I think sometimes people look at that expression as like it takes a bunch of adults to like act on that child. And I look at it as like it takes a bunch of adults interacting and supporting each other to help raise that child, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's good.
Not being isolated, not withdrawing, like having either a social group, like, close friends, having a therapist, a pastor, going to a mom's group or a dad's group, a Bible study, any of those things I think are a really great start, because a lot of times fear and anxiety, when they live within us, they, it's like they live in the darkness within us, and anything that we want to have improved needs light. Like the Bible talks a lot about light being shed on things. And so I think that, for us to be able to grow in those areas, we need to talk about them and confess them to other people, or else they will kind of stay in the secret and have a lot of power over us.
Yeah, and it just reminded me of that verse, that talks about in the Bible, that talks about it's for freedom that Christ has set us free. And so there's a sense in which the context of the gospel and the fact that we will never measure up. We will never be perfect enough. We will never be able to do everything right. We will never be able to obey the law perfectly. We'll never be able to manufacture a life with God. And so God had to come to us and had to actually do that for us so that we can live in a context that actually makes some kind of a sense, and we have an eternal hope. And again, circling back to like our experience here, often we'll encounter people that just are in a place where they've lost that focus, almost completely, and they don't have a lot of hope. And they look around, they go, everybody's kind of a liar. All the news is fake, and you get into this spiral. It seems like, and again, not being a mental health professional, but just we've seen this so often. And somewhere in there, we have to take a deep breath at some point, and perhaps it's with help to do this, to be able to say, yeah. But Jesus, yes. And that doesn't mean that all of the challenges go away just because one's a Christian, because that's also not true. But fundamentally, there is a context, a kingdom context, where the gospel does operate. And hopefully at some point, that freedom that we all, I think, are seeking at some level starts, I think, with understanding who we are, who we were made to be, and those kinds of things. Yeah, at least that's the way I see it anyway.
Yes,
Yeah.
Yeah. And I love what you said, that it's very important to be a part of a community, to shed light on those things.
Right.
For sure. Because we can't do it by ourselves. Especially, I often say today that parenting is one of the most difficult. There's an old Jim Dobson's book you may remember called, you may not remember because it was a long time ago, but Parenting Isn't for Cowards. I love the book title, right? Because it's not. I mean, it takes a lot of courage.
Right.
It really
Sure
does. Yeah. So if you were to think about, like, if you were going to talk to an individual or maybe to a couple and say, what's one or two things that are really key to remember as you're trying to manage or overcome those fears and anxieties, what kind of advice would you give?
So for individuals, I would definitely say do the work. Again, I mean, I can personally attest to, I've been to lots of therapy since I became a therapist. So I never take the approach that I'm healed. And I think that, as we walk through our lives, like we don't know everything. God reveals things, life reveals things to us. And in that moment, I decide, okay, well, am I going to read this book, or am I going to have some intentional, devotion time about this? Or am I going to go to my therapist and kind of unpack, this issue? So I definitely think, I use this analogy, is that if you went to your doctor and your doctor said, hey, you have some predispositions to heart disease, like, genetically, or maybe your lab values aren't right, but you can do this, and this, you would be like, okay, yeah, like I don't want to die of a heart attack, so I'm going to do those things. And I kind of take that same approach. I know that based on some of the things that I experienced growing up, I probably am at risk for divorce, because we know divorce is passed down along generations. And so I have to do a lot of active work, in my marriage, to acknowledge that and not just push it aside and like pretend that it's not going to happen. So I think as an individual, there has to be that humility there, to be able to say, like, God, I know I'm not perfect. You don't expect me to be perfect, but I think it's just such a great blessing that God has given us the opportunity to be like self-reflective and aware and have a spiritual relationship with him. And so we can use all of those opportunities to say, I can grow as a parent. And I also think that when we do that as a parent, we do heal some of the things that we harbor as hurts, like from our own childhood as well. And for couples, I can't emphasize this enough, and that's why I do so much couples work, is because I care about children as well, is that I think our society has moved to more of a child-centric society where it's all about the kiddos.
Yeah.
And that's wonderful. However, that was not necessarily God's design for marriage. And even if you kind of take the biblical part of it out, is your kids, are going to cleave from you at some point, and you are stuck with that person, right? And so you want to still like and love that person well beyond the 18 to whatever 20 something years that your kids are with you. But I think that as couples, we need to continue to strive for holiness and happiness in our marriage. We are the creators of the peaceful home. And I love, like, for example, like watching my children laugh, and they laugh a lot, and that to me is like a big sign of like that they're safe to do that. Also, my kids can be a little sassy, and I wouldn't say like disrespectful, but we let them kind of push a little bit because there's no fear that there'll be grand punishment or just undervaluing them, putting them down, those types of things. And so we do want them to make mistakes. We do want them to, maybe like push on the rubber band a little bit, and for us to be able to say, okay, like here's where you learn how to manage conflict. Here's where you learn how to say what you just said, but in a more loving and or respectful tone. So I think though, as parents, we have to set that tone. There's tons of research, for example, to show that when parents are more loving and affectionate towards each other, they are more loving and affectionate towards their children. So parents should be hugging, kissing, saying verbally expressive, loving things to each other. And that creates such a safety net for them. And on the opposite side of it, when I see that parents aren't doing that, there is a lot more anxiety in those children. And I want, I'm sensing that the kids may be picking up on the parents' anxiety within their own marriage.
Boy, isn't that it's so powerful? Because that's another thing as lifelong educators you see, is that so much it seems like kids take two routes with their upbringing. They either just kind of follow in it directly, or they run as fast as they can the other way. And there doesn't seem to be that much in between of those two things. What you hope is they're learning the lessons, like I think about where we failed as parents, and we did. I mean, we were far from perfect parents. Some things I think we did okay and did pretty well on. What I hope for my kids is that as they are having kids now and they actually are parenting, that they'll learn from the mistakes that we made, that they'll use that reference point of the Word of God as an external standard, and then their own experience and their communities and everything as well. And then that they'll be able to, not in a pressurized or anxious way, but they'll be able to live before the Lord and with their kids in a way that's a true shalom community of peace and safety and wholeness and hope. And that's kind of what we try to foster here at CCS as well. So to kind of we could do this all day, because this is really a great conversation.
Yeah, we could really talk to you for a long time.
But thinking about like maybe some takeaways, some things that we always try to get for our listeners, a little bit of, what kind of actions. We've already talked about some of those things, but anything else that you'd like to say just as a summary?
So when I read the Bible, I like to read it sometimes from a psychology perspective. And some of my favorite verses in the Bible remind me that God created us to experience a full range of emotions. So the Bible talks about don't be anxious, but guess what? That wouldn't have been addressed if we as humans didn't feel anxiety. One of my favorite verses is, "In your anger, do not sin." What it emphasizes there, you're gonna feel angry. You can't do whatever you want just because you feel that way. And then we're going to have fear. So I like to remind people that God created us as these feeling beings. I think that's a blessing. That's what brings joy in life. Pain is what tells us something's wrong and we need to change it. So we're going to feel these feelings, but we can lean into God. We can trust Him. We can pray for a community. There are just so many things, so many blessings and circumstances that He will give us to manage those feelings.
That's so good. Thank you.
That is so good.
That's
Thank
wonderful.
you so much for coming on
Yeah,
today.
thank
We
you.
have really enjoyed it.
It's been wonderful having the conversation.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that'll do it for today. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Gospel Centered Education Podcast. Join us next time when we discuss, or you're going to discuss with Mr. Collier.
Mr. Collier. We're going to talk a little bit about leadership and what that looks like here at CCS and just leadership in general.
So that'll be interesting.
Yeah, it will. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. It's been great being with you. And remember, as you go on your way, Jesus is Lord. Have a great day. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Gospel Centered Education Podcast, brought to you by Community Christian School in Tallahassee, Florida. You can find us online at myccs.org.